As you work on your React application and on your React components, you will notice in any project that your components eventually become bigger and bigger as you have more and more logic and JSX code in them. This is something which will naturally happen. That is why React has this component concept. This allows you to split your application into smaller building blocks where every building block, every component, is focused on one core task, you could say. And then you build your overall user interface by combining these building blocks. By doing that, you keep every component on its own relatively small and manageable, and you keep its code base small and manageable, and you still can build a complex user interface. Now, there is no hard rule when to build a new component versus adding more to an existing component. But in this component here, in this expense item component, we could already argue that it's getting a little bit too big, though I will say that this is definitely still all right. Nonetheless, we could argue that this date object here, this calendar item which we want to show on the user interface, could be treated as a separate component. Of course, the same case could be made for the title or the amount, or title and amount combined. As I said, there is no hard rule. But since for this calendar, we'll have a couple of helper constants and we'll have extra styles, I personally like to split this expense item component here into two components. The expense item component, which we already have, and then a new component for rendering this date in this calendar item look. And therefore, we're now going to create our second custom component. And for that, I'll create a new file in the components folder, and I'll name it expensedate.js. Now, as always, the file name is up to you, but I recommend that you follow this convention of naming it like this, starting with a capital character, one word, with every extra word also starting with a capital character. And again, it should also express what's happening inside of that file, what that component will be about. And this component will be about rendering the date of an expense. Hence, this sounds like a fitting name to me. Now in there, we create a new component, and that still is a function. Components in React are just regular functions with the extra twist of returning this JSX code. Now I'll name it expense date, again following this convention that we repeat the file name here, and I'll then export it to make it reusable outside of this file, like this. Now in here, I wanna calculate month, day, and year, so I'll cut this logic from expense item and move it to expense date, and therefore, of course, I need to accept props as a parameter here, and I do now expect that this component will be used such that a date prop is set. Now in expense item, I want to use this new component. But before we do that, I will actually grab this div with the month, year, and day inside of it and cut it as well and return that as JSX code inside of expense date.js. And now in expense item, at the top, we can add an import and import expense date from /expense date, like this. /expense date because we're looking in the same folder as the expense item.js file lives in. And now here, where we previously had our JSX code for the date, we instead output this expense date component. And as a side note, if you have a component that has no content between the opening and closing tags, you can also write it a little bit differently. You can write it as a self-closing element like this. This is then also okay. And we could do the same here in app.js with the expense item, since this also has no content between opening and closing tag. This is totally optional, but it is quite common to do that if there is no content between the opening and closing tag. So now we're using expense date in the expense item component. And we're doing this to move some of the JSX code and JavaScript logic out of the expense item into a separate component. This component is now again also reusable, and we can use it anywhere in this React application, not just in expense item. We could use it elsewhere as well if we wanted to. And it now also helps us with keeping expense item lean. This is now again shorter and therefore maybe a bit easier to maintain and manage. And the bigger your application gets and your components become, the more you want to look into splitting them up. Though again, just to really emphasize this, there is no hard rule on when to split. This is something which will come with experience, and you'll also see plenty of examples throughout this course. Now we must not forget though that our new expense date component needs a prop. It needs the date prop, at least that's the name I'm referring to here, inside of expense date, to, well, extract that date and format it, and extract the month, day, and year. Hence, on expense item, or in expense item, when we use expense date, we should set the date prop. And if you used a different name here in expense date, you of course want to use a different name here instead of date as well. Now the value which I pass here will just be props.date. And I know that this is now the point where it can get confusing, because now we're basically funneling some data through multiple levels of components. In the end, we can see this component tree come to life now, because now we don't just have the app component and then one other custom component, but we have multiple custom components and they are nested inside of each other. Just to make this really clear again, in the app component, we're using the expense item component, and inside of the expense item component, we're using the expense date component. And not just that, we're also forwarding our data with the help of props through multiple components. We're passing data from the app component into expense item, and in expense item, we're outputting some of that data, but other parts of the data, to be precise, the date, which we here also already received through props, is then forwarded even further into the expense date component, again by using props. Because props are our way of passing data from component A to B. And it's also totally fine to have a component which just passes data on. So in the end, you could say we pass data from app to expense date, the date to be precise is passed on, and we passed it on through expense item. Because that's how props work. We pass data from a component to a direct child component, so to a component which is used in that other component's JSX code, and we can't skip such a component. So if the date should be passed to expense date in the end, here in this case, since we use expense date instead of expense item, we first of all have to pass that data to expense item and then forward it to expense date. I hope this is clear. If it's not entirely clear yet, that's also something you're going to see in great detail and in many examples throughout the course. Okay, but with that we are forwarding the date and we get this separate component now. If we now save that all, we again see our date data being output here. Now we also want to have some styling, and therefore I'll add a new file, the expense date.css file, and you again find that file attached. You can just replace yours with it or open it and copy everything you find in the attached file into your expense date.css file. And once you did that, you can go to the expense date.js file, and at the very top of that file, import /expense date.css to make the entire project setup aware of that CSS file, and then add a couple of CSS classes here. On the surrounding div, we add a class name of expense-date, for example. On that month div, we add expense-date __ month. For the year div, we add expense-date __ year. And for the day, we add expense date __ day. And here I imported the wrong file. This should of course be expense date CSS. And with all of that done, if we save this, now we got this nice look here for our dates. And this looks much nicer, and we also practiced how we can add yet another component. And adding this component was optional. We could have put everything into expense item, the entire JSX code, which we have in a separate component now, the helper constants, we could have added this all into one component. We could have also added the CSS code here in the expense item CSS code. But then this expense item component would become bigger and bigger. And whilst in this case it would have still been fine, it is generally a good practice to keep your components small and focused, and that is why we did extract this extra component here.